A gunshot cracked across the yard, and Thomas Calder came off the porch with his rifle half raised before he even knew what he was aiming at. "Hold your fire," a voice called from the dark tree line, low and even, though it shook at the edges. "We mean no harm to you or yours." Rain came down in sheets that night, the kind that turned the yard to soup and swallowed the barn lantern's light within 20 feet. Thomas stood at the edge of his porch with water running off his hat brim, rifle steady, staring into the black where the voice had come from. Behind him, the house was dark and silent, the way it had been dark and silent for 3 years now. "Show yourselves," he said, slow. They came out of the rain like something the storm itself had shaped, and set walking, 6 of them, then a 7th carried between 2 others, and Thomas's stomach dropped when he saw the blood soaking through the blanket wrapped around the smallest one, a boy no older than 8, his breath coming in thin, wet gasps. The man who had called out stepped in front of the rest, hands open at his sides, rain sliding down a face lined with more grief than years. "My name is Elan," the man said. "This is my brother's boy. He is dying. I know what you have heard about us. I know what your town calls us. I am asking you for one night, only one night, and a dry place and whatever mercy is left in you." Thomas did not lower the rifle right away. He looked past Elan to the others, an old woman gripping a young man's arm like it was the last solid thing in the world, a girl of maybe 16 with her jaw set hard against fear, a woman who could only be the boy's mother, kneeling in the mud beside the blanket with her hand pressed to a wound that wasn't slowing. He looked at the boy's face, gray under the brown of it, lips gone the color of ash. "They call you the Apache who burned the Doyle spread," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "They call us many things," Elan said. "None of them are true. But I did not come here tonight to argue history with you, Mr. Calder. I came because this boy has maybe 2 hours left in him if he lies in the rain, and maybe a chance if he does not." Thomas stood there a long moment with the water running down the barrel of his rifle, and somewhere behind his ribs a decision he hadn't examined in 3 years cracked open like dry wood. He lowered the gun. "Bring him inside," he said. "All of you. Quick before I think better of it." None of them moved at first, not trusting the words any more than they'd trusted the silence before them. It was the old woman who broke first, pulling the young man's arm and starting forward, and after that the rest followed, carrying the boy up the porch steps. And through the door Thomas held open into a house that had not had more than one voice in it for longer than he liked to remember. Thomas Calder had built that house with his own hands 9 years back, on land his father had scraped together from nothing and left him along with a debt and a stubborn streak. He had built it for a family, and for 2 years he'd had one, a wife named Rose who laughed at things that weren't funny, just to see him smile, and a daughter, Mary, who used to fall asleep in the hayloft waiting for him to finish the evening chores. Fever took them both inside of 9 days the winter. Mary turned 4, and Thomas had spent every day since learning how a man goes on living in a house built for laughter that no longer comes. He ran 300 head of cattle alone on land that needed 2 men, maybe 3. He rode fence lines before dawn and mended what winter broke. He spoke to his horse more than he spoke to people in town, and the town, for its part, had stopped expecting much conversation out of him. They called him hard, they called him closed off. A few of the kinder ones called him a man who'd had the stuffing knocked out of him and never got it back. None of them were entirely wrong, and none of them knew the whole of it, because Thomas had stopped trying to explain grief to people who wanted him to simply be finished with it. The ranch sat 2 miles out from a town called Piedrasica, close enough to smell the wood smoke on still evenings, far enough that Thomas mostly kept to himself unless supplies ran low. He liked it that way. The land didn't ask him questions he couldn't answer, and the cattle didn't look at him with pity, and out here a man's grief could stretch out and take up as much room as it needed without anybody remarking on it. It was a hard, plain life, but it was his, and until that storm-black night with the rifle in his hands, he had believed it was the only kind of life left to him, one of chores and silence and the particular ache of an empty second chair at the supper table. He had no way of knowing, standing there dripping in his own doorway with 6 strangers filing past him into the lamplight, that the shape of his life was about to change in ways the whole valley would be talking about before the year was through. Inside, Thomas cleared the kitchen table with one sweep of his forearm and laid the boy on it, and the boy's mother, a woman named Sula, though he would not learn her name until later, set to peeling back the blanket with hands that had clearly done this work before. The wound was in the boy's side, a gash gone deep and angry, the kind that came from a fall onto rock, not from any gun or blade. Thomas fetched what whiskey he had, and clean rags, and the sewing kit Rose had left behind that he had never once had the heart to give away. "You know wounds," Elon said, watching him work. "I know cattle," Thomas said. "It's near enough the same in the places that matter." He worked by lamplight while the rain hammered the roof, and nobody in that kitchen spoke more than they had to. The old woman, whom Elon called grandmother, though she was no blood relation, sat with her hands folded and her eyes closed, murmuring something too soft to make words of. The girl, 16 and sharp-eyed, stood near the door the whole while as though she expected to have to run at any moment, and did not sit until her uncle told her, gently, that she could. The young man, Koa, kept his hand near his knife and his gaze on Thomas's hands, watching every motion for the wrong kind of intention. It was near midnight when Thomas finally set the needle down and wiped his hands, and the boy's breathing had leveled into something that sounded like sleep, instead of drowning. "He'll live," Thomas said, "if the fever doesn't turn on him by morning." Sula's face did something complicated then, something between collapse and gratitude, and she pressed her forehead to the boy's small hand and did not say anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying. They did not leave in the morning. The fever came as Thomas had feared, and it held the boy for 2 days, and Thomas found himself, without quite deciding to, giving up his own bed for the sick child and sleeping in the barn on a pile of feed sacks, and boiling water at all hours, and riding to the far spring for the cold, clean stuff. Sula swore worked better against fever than the well water. He did not ask them to leave. They did not ask to stay. It simply happened. The way weather happens, one gray hour folding into the next until 4 days had gone by, and nobody had spoken of moving on. On the second morning, Elan found Thomas at the fence line mending a post the wind had loosened, and stood beside him a while without a word before he picked up the second mallet lying in the grass and set to work on the next post over. "You don't have to do that," Thomas said. "I know," Elan said, and kept working. They fell into a rhythm neither of them announced, Elan and Koa, mending fence and hauling feed, while the women tended the boy, and without being asked scrubbed the kitchen Thomas had let go to ruin and 3 years of not caring, and mended 2 shirts he'd been meaning to throw out, and cooked meals that filled the house with a smell it hadn't held since Rose was alive. Thomas noticed it the way a man notices weather changing, not all at once, but suddenly, in the middle of an evening, aware that something in the air had shifted, and he hadn't caught the moment it started. The girl, whose name was Tessa, an English name given her by a trader, years back, that she'd simply kept, she told him once, because it was easier for outsiders and cost her nothing, was the one who talked to him first, really talked, on the 3rd evening, sitting on the porch step while her brother slept easier inside. "You're not what they said you'd be," she told him. "Neither are you," Thomas said, and she almost smiled at that, the first almost smile he'd gotten off any of them. He learned, in pieces, over evenings that stretched longer than he meant them to, why they were on that road in that storm to begin with. Elan's family had held land along the Rio Verde for 3 generations before a cavalry survey redrew the boundary lines and a government agent decided the paper mattered more than the people standing on the dirt it described. They'd been moved twice already, each time to worse ground. Each time promised it would be the last time. The boy had fallen from a rock face, running from men who weren't soldiers, and weren't quite bandits either. Men who rode for hire, and worked for whoever paid best to clear Apache families off land somebody else wanted. Ellen had chosen Thomas's ranch that night not out of hope so much as desperation. His was the only house within 10 miles that didn't have a rifle pointed at Apache faces as a matter of course, or so a trader passing through had once told him years back in a conversation Ellen had filed away and never expected to need. That trader was wrong about most people, Elon said. But he was right about you. Thomas didn't answer that directly. He wasn't sure yet how he felt about being right about anything. Elon sat that 5th evening on an overturned crate near the corral, whittling a scrap of cedar into nothing in particular, watching Thomas check a mare's hoof by lantern light, and when he finally spoke, it was in the voice of a man laying down something heavy he'd carried a long way. "I have a rule," Elon said. "I made it 11 years ago and I have kept it since, and it has kept my family breathing when other rules would have gotten us killed. The rule is this: we do not trust a white man's kindness past the morning it's given. We take what help is offered, we say the words that are expected of us, and we are gone before the sun sets twice." "You've been here 5 nights, Thomas said. "I know," Elon said, and the admission cost him something visible. "That is why I am telling you the rule now before it costs me more than it already has." He told Thomas about a rancher near the Gila, years back, who had taken in Elon's cousin's family through a hard winter, fed them, sheltered them, called them friends by firelight, and then, come spring, when a posse rode through asking questions about a robbery 3 counties over, had handed over their names and their camp's location for the reward money without so much as a warning. 2 men died in the raid that followed. Elon had been 19, and he had helped bury them. "I do not say this to accuse you," Elon said. "I say it because I have watched my brother's boy sleep safe in your bed for 5 nights, and some part of me that I do not fully trust has started to believe that safety is real. That part of me has been wrong before, Mr. Calder. It was wrong in a way that put 2 men in the ground. I would rather insult you with my suspicion tonight than bury someone else because I let myself forget the lesson." Thomas set down the mare's hoof slow and looked at him. "You're not insulting me," he said. "You're telling me the truth about what the world's done to you. That's a different thing." "Is it?" Elon said. And it wasn't really a question, and Thomas didn't have an answer that would have satisfied either of them. So he let the silence sit there instead, and eventually Elon went back to his whittling, and the cedar in his hand slowly became, over the following nights, a small carved horse that he set on the porch rail without a word. And Thomas understood it for what it was. Not quite trust, but a step taken toward it. Offered the way. Elon offered most things. Now, sideways and guarded and real. Word of a rancher sheltering Apaches did not stay quiet in a town the size of Piedra Seca. It took 9 days for Silas Whitlock to ride out, and he did not come alone. 2 hired men flanked him, and he did not dismount when he reached the yard, sitting his horse like a man surveying property he already considered his. "Heard you've got Apaches living in your kitchen, Calder," Whitlock said. "Heard it's the same bunch been raiding stock along the Verde. Heard the Doyle place lost 11 head to them not 2 months back." "Then you heard wrong on every count," Thomas said, standing his ground in the yard with his arms loose at his sides. Deliberately unarmed, deliberately calm. "These people came to my door hurtin', asking for shelter. I gave it. That's the whole of it. The whole of it is you're harboring the enemy. And the town's got a right to know about it," Whitlock said. He had wanted the Calder land for 6 years, ever since the spring dried up on his own eastern acreage, and Thomas's remained sweet and full, and everyone in the valley knew it, though nobody said it aloud in polite company. Sheriff Purdy's going to want a word. Might be the town decides it doesn't take kindly to a man giving comfort to raiders. "They're not raiders," Thomas said. "And you know it, or you'd have brought the sheriff with you instead of 2 men who work for your brand." Whitlock's jaw tightened at that because it was true. and true things said plainly had a way of landing harder than shouted ones. "Doesn't much matter what I know," he said. "Matters what the town believes. And the town's scared, Calder, and scared people don't split hairs about who's guilty and who's just standing too close to guilty." He turned his horse, then paused. "You've got 2 days to send them off your land, or I'll make sure Purdy rides out here himself with more men than you've got bullets. Your choice, how peaceable that goes." He rode off with his men trailing him, and Thomas stood in the yard a long while after the dust settled, and when he turned back toward the house, he found Alon standing on the porch, having heard every word of it. His face, unreadable in the way Thomas had learned, meant he was working hard to keep it that way. "You should let us go," Elan said quietly, "before it costs you your land, maybe your life." "The boy still can't ride a full day yet," Thomas said, "and I'm not in the habit of handing people to wolves because a coward asked me nicely." "This isn't your fight. It's happening on my land," Thomas said. "That makes it my fight whether I like the terms or not." The 2 days passed in a strange, taut quiet, everyone in the house aware of the clock running, though nobody spoke of it directly, the boy improving by the hour in a way that felt almost cruel in its timing. Strong enough now to sit up, to eat, to ask Tessa questions about the strange, quiet man whose bed he'd been sleeping in. But not yet strong enough, Sula insisted, for the hard riding that fleeing would require. On the evening of the 2nd day, the sky to the east went the color of a bruise, and the wind picked up in a way that made every animal on the ranch restless at once, and Thomas, standing in the yard with his face turned toward that wrongness in the sky, understood before anyone said it aloud that the storm building out there was going to be worse than the one that had first brought Elan's family to his door. The fire started an hour before midnight, whether by lightning or by men who'd grown impatient waiting for Thomas's 2 days to run out. Nobody would know for certain until much later, and it came up fast through the dry grass on the eastern range where 200 head of Thomas's cattle were bedded down for the night with a wind behind it that turned a grass fire into something closer to a wall. Thomas was already saddled and riding before he'd finished shouting the word fire into the house, and he did not expect what happened next, though he would think back on it for years afterward, as the moment everything between them changed for good. Koa was beside him within a minute, riding bareback on Thomas's second horse with nothing but a rope and his own nerve, and Alon came a breath after that on the mule they kept for hauling feed. No time to argue about whose fight this was anymore, because a man's herd burning was every hand's fight once the flames were running. They worked through smoke thick enough to blind a man, cutting cattle from the burning grass and driving them toward the creek, and it was Koa who spotted the calf trapped against a fence line with the fire closing from 2 directions, and it was Koa who went in after it without waiting to be told, dragging the animal free with rope burns cutting into both his palms, while Thomas beat the flames back from his legs with a wet saddle blanket. Tessa rode fence the whole night, warning off strays, and Sula stood in the yard with buckets, and the boy at her side handing them along a line. And by the time the wind finally turned and the fire burned itself out against the creek's wet bank, every soul on that ranch had done work that put their own body between danger and somebody else's, without a single one of them stopping first to ask whose blood ran in whose veins. Thomas found Elin afterward sitting on the porch step, forearms blistered, watching the last orange threads die out along the eastern ridge, and Thomas sat down beside him without a word, both of them too tired and too scoured out to speak for a good long while. "That fire wasn't lightning," Elon said finally. "No," Thomas agreed, "it wasn't. You lost how many head?" "Don't know yet. Fewer than I would have without 4 extra hands willing to ride into smoke for cattle that weren't theirs." Thomas turned to look at him. "You didn't have to do that." "Neither did you," Elon said. 5 nights ago, you could have turned us back into the rain and lost nothing but your conscience. You didn't. I told myself I would leave the moment my nephew could ride and settle the debt of your kindness with distance the way I always have. But a man who rides into his own fire to save my brother's boy's calf has earned more from me than a quiet leaving in the night." He looked out at the smoldering ridge. The rule I told you about. I think I have been keeping it too long, Mr. Roddy. Colder. I think it has protected me from some things and cost me others, and I am no longer certain the balance was ever what I believed it to be. Sheriff Purdy rode out 2 mornings later, not with Whitlock's hired men, but with 3 of the town's own, summoned by a wired complaint and a rumor of Apache raiders sheltering at the Calder place, and he found instead a burned Eastern Range, a rancher, and 4 Apache strangers, all bearing rope burns and smoke-reddened eyes. And a story that didn't match anything Whitlock had told the town at all. Whitlock says these people are the ones been raiding the Doyle stock, Purdy said, standing in the yard with his hat pushed back, taking in the scene with the flat, careful look of a man who'd learned not to trust the first version of any story. Whitlock's wrong, Thomas said, and I expect he knows it. Ask him how many acres of good grass sit between his dried-up spring and my East Range sheriff, and ask yourself why a man who wants that grass would be so eager to see me run off the very family that just helped save it from burning to ash. It was Tessa, unexpectedly, who stepped forward then, standing straight in front of the sheriff with the particular courage of someone who has decided fear has cost her enough already. The men who raided the Doyle spread wore no paint and spoke no Apache, she said. I know because they rode past our camp 3 weeks before it happened, 6 white men with rifles asking which way to Doyle's water, and my uncle gave them the wrong direction on purpose because something in their manner made him uneasy. If you want the truth of who burned the Doyle stock, Sheriff, you would do better asking those men's names than asking mine. Purdy studied her a long moment, and then looked to Elan, who added nothing, offered no defense, simply stood with the quiet dignity of a man who had decided for once to let the truth stand on its own rather than dress it up, in the appeasing words he'd learned to offer men with badges. That's a fine story, Purdy said. Doesn't prove much on its own. It doesn't need to prove itself alone, Thomas said. Ride to the Doyle place. Ask old man Doyle himself what direction the men who hit his herd came from, and how many, and whether any of them spoke a word of Apache while they did it. Then ride back here and tell me whether you still believe Whitlock's version, or whether you've started wondering what it is Whitlock's really after. Purdy did ride to the Doyle place, and what he found there, a foreman willing to describe 6 white riders with no accent and no paint, and a set of boot prints and a dry wash that matched none of the horses in Elan's small party, unraveled Whitlock's story faster than any of them expected. It took only 4 more days for the truth to finish coming apart at every seam Whitlock had sewn it with. A trader recalled selling rifle cartridges to a group of white riders the week before the Doyle raid, men he'd never seen before or since, one of Whitlock's own hired hands drunk and loose-tongued in the saloon. Let slip that his boss had paid good money to men willing to make trouble look like it wore the wrong face, and by the time Purdy pieced it together, half the town already understood, with the particular shame of people realizing how easily they'd been led, that the raiders they'd feared had never existed at all, only a rancher's greed for water and grass. Dressed up in old fears, the town had never bothered to question. The town meeting was called on a Sunday, in the small clapboard church that doubled as Piedrasica's only public hall, and Thomas had not expected to be asked to speak. Still less had he expected Elan to stand beside him and do the same. But when Purdy laid out what the investigation had turned up, and the room went thick with the particular silence of people, caught out in a wrong they'd been comfortable believing, it was Elan who rose first. 11 years ago, he said, and his voice carried farther in that quiet room than Thomas would have guessed it could. I made myself a rule. I decided that no kindness from your kind of people could be trusted past a single morning, because trusting further had once cost people. I loved their lives. I have kept that rule faithfully since, through winters that might have gone easier had I broken it. Through offers of help I turned away out of a caution I believed was wisdom. He paused and found Thomas's eyes across the room. I was wrong to make it a rule for all of you, the way you were wrong to make a rule out of all of us. A man named Thomas Calder opened his door to my family in a storm, asking nothing, expecting nothing. And when the town you all live in turned against him for it, he did not hand us over to save his own standing. I do not say this to shame you. I say it because I think this town has been afraid of a story it invented for itself, and it cost an innocent man his herd and very nearly his home, and it very nearly cost my brother's son his life before that. Nobody in the church said anything for a long moment. Then Doyle himself, the man whose stolen herd had started the whole rumor, stood up from his pew, hat in hand. "I owe you an apology I didn't know I owed till just now," he said to Elon, plain and unadorned. "Same as I owe you one, Thomas, for believing the worst of you quicker than I believed the best." It was not a grand reversal, not delivered with music or ceremony, just a room full of ordinary embarrassed people slowly admitting they had been wrong, one after another, the way real towns actually change their minds. In small, halting sentences rather than sweeping speeches. Whitlock was not in that church. He had left the county 3 days prior, ahead of a fraud charge Purdy was already preparing, and nobody much mourned his absence. The seasons turned twice before the valley fully settled into its new shape, but settled it did. Elon's family did not leave that spring, nor the one after. The boy, healed and grown 2 inches taller than anyone expected, took to calling the ranch his second home before anybody had quite decided to make that arrangement official, and somewhere in the unremarked accumulation of ordinary days it simply became true. Elon and Koa built a second small house on the north corner of Thomas's land, close enough to call across the fence line of a morning, and the 2 families' cattle grazed the same grass without anybody remembering to ask permission first. Tessa, sharp-eyed and unbowed as ever, took to teaching at the schoolhouse in town once enough parents stopped flinching at the idea, and she was, within 2 years, simply the schoolteacher, the way Thomas was simply the rancher out past the East Bend. The specific shape of old fear worn smooth by nothing more dramatic than time and proximity, and the plain daily evidence of people being decent to one another. Thomas Calder, who had built a house for a family and then spent 3 years alone inside its silence, found that silence filled again, not by ghosts, and not quite by the family he'd lost, but by a boy who liked to sit on the porch rail whittling cedar, the way his uncle had taught him, and by an old woman who took over the kitchen garden and grew squash, Rose would have loved, and by evenings that once again had more than one voice in them, laughing at things that weren't especially funny, just to hear the sound of it. He married Sula's younger sister 2 summers later, a woman named Halle, who had come to visit, and simply never quite left. And if you rode out past Piedra Seca today and asked anyone in that valley about the Calder place, they would tell you it's known for its cattle, its water, and its strange, wide mix of a family that nobody quite remembers not being there. If a stranger had come to your door in a storm that night, hurt and afraid and asking only for shelter, what would you have done? It is easy, from a warm room years removed from the danger, to say you would have opened it without a second thought. It is harder in the moment when fear and rumor, and the easy comfort of believing what everyone around you already believes, are all pulling at your hand before it ever reaches the latch. Thomas Calder did not open his door because he was fearless. He opened it because, for one night, he chose to see the people standing in the rain rather than the story he'd been told about them, and that one choice built him a family and a home wider and fuller than the one grief had left him with. If this story moved you, I'd love for you to like this video, subscribe for more stories like it, and tell me in the comments what you would have done standing in Thomas Calder's place, in the rain, with the latch under your hand.